The Democrats do not stand for defunding police.
Some might say that the other party was for defunding the police. I'll let others say that, but that's a piece.
What in the actual F? Like, seriously? Remember, this was their agenda, and now they have to run away from their own agenda. The Democrats are in a bit of trouble. So here's the thing. They're pushing forward with this radical agenda in the military, in every area of American life, actually. And this stuff is not popular. For some reason, Democrats seem to think that Twitter is real. Now, there's a study that came out from Pew Research that I think is quite important on this topic. The study came out October of 2020, and what it showed is that basically Twitter is dominated by Democrats. What they found is that most U.S. adults on Twitter post only rarely, but a small share of highly active users, most of whom are Democrats, produce the vast majority of tweets. The Pew Research Center found that just 10% of users produced 92% of all tweets from U.S. adults since last November. So it's an echo chamber, right? Between the 10% of users producing 92% of the tweets. 69% of these highly prolific users identify as Democrats or Democratic-leaning independents. What this means is that, number one, the platform has a larger share of Democrats than Republicans. Number two, because it's an echo chamber in which the most powerful people are Democrats and the most frequent tweeters are Democrats, it's easier to ratio a Republican than a Democrat, and it's easier to get tons of retweets if you're a Democrat than a Republican. And this leads people into a belief that the Democratic wild progressive agenda is significantly more popular than it is. It simply is not. A good proof of this, David French pointed this out, and it's a great point. Andrew Yang had nearly 2 million Twitter followers during the New York mayoral race. Eric Adams had 14,000. Eric Adams just skunked Andrew Yang because the real world is not Twitter. And the same thing was true in Bernie Sanders versus Joe Bidenville. Twitter is not the real world. Yet, because that is the source of news, and people are inevitably biased by the news that they consume, people on the left, viewing Twitter as the real world as opposed to an echo chamber, tend to think that their policies are much more popular than they are. Then they enact those policies, and it turns out the policies suck. Nowhere is this truer than when it comes to policing and crime. So the Democrats are about to get their asses handed them in 2022 on the issue of crime. The crime rates in the United States have skyrocketed. They'd already started skyrocketing before the riots in 2020. They actually started skyrocketing in 2014, 2015 with the Ferguson riots. And then it calmed down a little bit. And then in 2020, they just exploded. You're seeing the murder rates in virtually every major metropolitan area dominated by Democrats. Just unbelievable numbers. Unbelievable numbers. And members of the police forces are pointing this out. So, for example, the LAPD police chief, he said, we were beating back crime. We were doing a pretty good job of it. And now that's all gone.
We've led the country in crime reduction over this past decade. We've shown that cops count, that police matter, that community engagement is the leading aspect of crime prevention, and that crime reduction also is tied to effective policing, identifying those that are involved in the violence, bringing them before the justice system, and holding them accountable. All of that in this last year has been terribly and devastatingly impacted.
Okay, so the reality, of course, is that crime in Los Angeles is up wildly. Year over year, the murder rate is up like 25%. And that is not a great shock. We've seen the same thing in every major American city. So the Democrats have been faced with a simple reality, and that is that their preferred policies with regard to the cops, blaming the cops for all racial disparities in crime statistics, suggesting that getting rid of the cops is the solution to all of this, blaming systemic racism, none of this is actually solving the problem of actual crime in which people get hurt or killed. So they've come up with a few different strategies. One is to deny there is a problem. So, for example, you have DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, whose most important contribution to fighting crime was painting a giant Black Lives Matter mural on the streets of Washington, D.C., and then watching as many of her citizens just got shot in the streets. She went on in front of the Senate, and she claimed that there was only one night of rioting in D.C. last summer, which is weird because there are literally millions of people who remember D.C. being curfewed for like a week.
Do you have a property damage estimate from the summer riots?
I'm glad to hear you say that you are opposed to riotous behavior, whether it happened on 16th Street or here.
Madam Mayor, could you answer the question? Do you have an estimate of the property damage during the summer riots?
I know that we had one night of rioting in the district in the summer.
Do you know how many people were arrested for the summer riots?
We've had dozens of people arrested over the last year.
Okay, so pretty impressive denial that anything went wrong in Washington, D.C. under her auspices, even though, again, I know lots of people who are living in Washington, D.C. who are basically bunkered down in their apartment for a week on end while people ran roughshod through the city. Okay, that's one strategy. One strategy is to downplay this. You saw this from Mayor Lori Lightfoot yesterday. She did the same exact thing in Chicago. She said, no, crime is actually down from last year when it was up dramatically. So really well done. The other strategy is to deny that Democrats are behind the sort of defund, undercut the police routine in the first place. So this is pushed by Senator Mazie Hirono, legitimately the stupidest member of the United States Senate from Hawaii, suggesting that Democrats don't stand for defunding the police. Oh, interesting, because it seems like kind of your vice president was calling to bail out rioters last year. And also, Joe Biden suggested shifting funding away from the cops and towards social workers. And also, there's been an attempt by the Biden DOJ to crack down on police departments across the country. But don't worry, they're not anti-cop.
The Democrats do not stand for defunding police. The police have a major role to play, especially community policing and reducing the incidence of violence and crime in our communities. But it is a multifaceted issue and concerns, and that's how we should approach it. It is not all about let's just get tough on crime.
It's not about we'll just get tough on crime. So it's not about defunding the police, but also it's not about getting tough on crime. Also, we're not against defunding the police, except for, those of us who are, like India Walton, who just won the Buffalo mayoral primary, Democrat, explaining that their plan is to shift money away from the cops and put it toward quote unquote community development. So this is going well.
My plan is to put our resources into community, into neighborhoods, and govern in a deeply democratic way that the people who are governed have say over the decision-making process and how resources are deployed in our community.
So, yeah, they're not against defunding the police except when they're completely for defunding the police. But here's the good news. They can also blame Republicans for defunding the police. That's literally what Jen Psaki tried to do. She literally, this is so, the gall of this is pretty rich. So you have an entire Democratic Party that has embraced the notion that systemic racism in American policing is what ails the United States in terms of both race relations and crime. And then you have Jen Psaki get up there and say, oh yeah, and it's Republicans who want to defund the police. Yeah, lady, my God, not all of us are double-digit IQs here.
Part of his announcement is also ensuring there's specific guidance to communities across the country to ensure that they have funding to get more community police around the country, something that was supported by the American Jobs Plan that was voted into law by Democrats just a couple of months ago. Some might say that the other party was for defunding the police. I'll let others say that, but that's a piece.
You see how it's cute? Because in the infrastructure package that was $2 trillion, there's like $5 for the cops, and then they voted against it. So they hate the... it's unbelievable, the gaslighting. So remember, this was their agenda, and now they have to run away from their own agenda. Joy Behar did the same thing. She blamed Trump for rising crime. Yes, probably it was the president who was calling for law and order, the same president you were screaming at for suggesting perhaps we might use the Insurrection Act to quell riots in most of America's major cities. The same president you were yelling at for putting federal troops in places, or federal officers rather, in places like Portland to protect federal property. Probably it was him. Yes, Joy, it wasn't you, it was him.
Every president since Clinton inherited basically a declining crime rate, and then it continued to decline until Trump came along, because Trump presided over the greatest crime rise in modern American history. The murder rate shot up 26%, and mass shootings spiked. Hate crime spiked more than 20% during his presidency. Now, I don't want to lay the whole thing at his feet, but he did create 4 years normalizing crime.
4 years normalizing crime? What in the actual F? Like, seriously? Who's got two thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?